Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Michelle Peterson, and I'm the training manager for the Empire Justice Center. I do need to note that today's webinar is made possible by the New York State Attorney General Homeownership Protection Program. And before we get started, just a quick note on how you can interact with us today. Everyone has entered the webinar in a listen-only mode. If you have any questions on any of the material that's being presented during the webinar, you can enter your question using the questions pane located on your control panel. We'll be addressing questions, both during and at the end of today's presentation. The materials for today's webinar, you can find those and they can be downloaded from the handouts pane on your control panel. If you have any issues with downloading the materials, I'm happy to send them to you. I'll put my email address in the chat box so you can do that if you have any issues. There is no CLE credit for this webinar today, but we are happy to issue certificates of attendance for anyone that needs one. You can send me an email directly requesting your certificate, and we'll get that out to you right away. And of course, at the end of the webinar, you're going to be asked to complete a webinar evaluation. So if you take a moment and complete that, we'd appreciate it. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to our webinar moderator, who is Ellie Pepper today.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited about this two-part series that we're doing and want to welcome Autumn Lubin as our presenter. And many of you know her from the classes that she's done live here in Albany. Autumn is the founder of Yellowwood Pathways, a consulting firm specializing in training, curriculum development, and technical assistance for nonprofits, lenders in the real estate industry. She's developed, produced, and conducted many online training programs. She brings 30 years of business experience to her work, and some of the organizations that she works with include NeighborWorks America, several housing finance agencies, Fannie and Freddie, the Minnesota Association of Minnesota, Don't Borrow Trouble, Minnesota Homeownership Center, Department of Commerce, etc. And prior to consulting, she was the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, was with them for 14 years, managing their loan portfolio. So here she is, and she's going to do this two-part cultural competency series. So Autumn, take it away.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to everybody who signed up to do this. I'm really excited, as always, to be with my New York people, even if I'm not exactly in New York. Sometimes if any of you have heard the travails of my travels to Albany, this might be the better way for me to get information out to people that are in New York. So with that said, let's just kind of talk about what we're going to do here. So I've titled this Honest, Humble, and Seeking, a Path to Cultural Competency, because those are the characteristics, the attributes that you need to have to really become culturally competent. You have to be really honest about who you are and where you are and what you know and what you don't know, and that humility of not knowing and knowing that you don't know and breaking down what you think you know and realizing maybe that isn't true, and then seeking and being interested in more information and really have your heart in that. All of that together will take you down a path of cultural competency that will allow you to interact with other cultures in a way that is respectful and allows everybody to maintain their dignity, and actually is kind of fun, rather than with trepidation or stumbling over yourself or terrified you're going to say the wrong thing, all that sort of thing. So that's where this whole title came from for this webinar series. And if you've been in any of my classes, you'll know that I'm a word freak. And so there's always going to be lots of words to kind of keep you inspired, keep you moving, or get you thinking. And so Lisa Grace Burns says, I often think the path of clarity is less about seeking answers and more about readying ourselves to receive them. So some of this is about asking our questions, but it's also preparing ourselves to find out what the answers are. And then just being honest, because when we're honest, that comes out in how we act and how others perceive us. If we are honest with ourselves and honest with others, that shows. We don't have to say we're honest because it comes out. And then this whole humility thing, I swear, the older I get, the more I believe that the answer to almost every life issue is you start with humility. I really honestly believe that. I'm afraid I'm getting old enough to be able to say that with some authority, and that just essentially means I'm getting old. So again, I'm Autumn Lubin. I put CEO on here. We have no titles. This is my husband and I and our business, and this is what we do. I'm the one that's out there, doing this stuff, and he's the one that's here keeping my feet on the ground and kind of keeping the home fires burning and that sort of thing. We chose the Karen as kind of our logo because Karens are used for wayfinding when you're out walking in the woods or traveling. And what they do is they mark your path and help you remember places where you either want to go back or how you get back. So that was the purpose of choosing the Karen. So in this space, in this webinar space, whoopsie daisy, sorry, we are going to unplug as much as possible. I know that y'all are in your offices, and I know that a lot of you are gathered around one computer screen. But I'm going to ask if you can turn your phones off. Turn them off. Just allow yourself this moment to be here and learn this topic and share and ask your questions and be totally present, or at least unplug as much as you can. I'm going to ask that you actively participate. I am a huge believer in wisdom of the room. You guys know stuff you don't know you know. And so I want to make sure that you are encouraged to actively participate. Put your questions in there. Put your comments in the chat box. We're going to be monitoring that throughout the webinar. So go ahead and do that. Ask questions. If you have a question of clarity about something I'm saying at that moment, make sure you get it into the question box. Ellie's going to be monitoring that. And she can pause me and say, hey, somebody needs this clarified before we move on. We can do that. Also, at 4 different points during the webinar, we're going to have a place for you to ask questions. And so we're going to truly expect you to have questions. And if you don't have questions, that's fine too. I mean, it might be one of those things that the questions arise next week after you've had a minute to think about it. We want you to share any wisdom that you have, any knowledge that you have about this topic, experiences, that sort of thing. And then finally, this is an hour of your time. And so let's enjoy it. Let's enjoy this time together. I don't always get to talk about all the most scintillating topics. I mean, I think this one's really interesting. But what I'm going to say is no matter what topic it is, I think we can always enjoy the time that we're talking about it. So what are you going to get out of this webinar today? You're going to walk away with some self-awareness about how your worldview, how your biases, your assumptions get between you and being culturally competent. I'm going to share with you some vocabulary about cultural competency, what the differences are between race, ethnicity, and culture. We're going to talk about, this is an ongoing growth process. Nobody ever stops learning about cultural competency. There is no of learning. And so we're going to work with this cultural competency continuum and take a look at the different categories. And then I'm going to give you just a few tips to broaden your cultural competency, and there is a handout that kind of move you further into understanding yourself and your barriers. So that's where we are. So some keys to today's learning. First, we have to accept that working with people is inevitably a cross-cultural experience. And I don't care if you're all the same race. I don't care if you're all the same ethnicity. There are going to be different cultures within all of that. You can look exactly the same and have different cultures. You can look very different and have similar cultures. And so we need to understand that working together, we're going to bump into other cultures no matter what we do, no matter where we live, no matter who we are. And this kind of underscores what I just said a minute ago. Becoming culturally competent is a process, not an endpoint. This is something that's ongoing. And then in some cultural context. So things we do, things we say, things we think have a cultural context. They can all be tied back to something in our world or another world that we have experienced, but they all will have cultural context. Okay, here's the part where I might get a little pushback, and you might get a little unhappy with me. You don't know what you don't know. And that's where we have to start with this. Understand that humility has to be the baseline for where we get started. Even more, you may not even know what you think you know. So things you think you got handled, you might discover that you don't. Things that you think you figured out, you might discover that how you figured them out isn't quite right. So we got to allow that too. And we have to accept that we might know less than we think, that we just don't realize that we don't know. And then lastly, here's the big deal. You have to want to know what you don't know. So again, humble, honest, seeking. So we have to know what we don't. We have to have that curiosity. Another piece of today's learning, next week's learning, we have to be ready to accept where we are and then take ourselves to where we want to be. And getting to that point of accepting where we are in this whole learning process, sometimes we have to realize that maybe where we thought we were in our head isn't exactly where we are when we start really considering all the different pieces. We have to be honest in our assessments. And one of the materials you have, one of the handouts you have, is an assessment of sorts. And it basically helps you walk through the steps I am and what's impacted me along the way and how that's what I'm doing with others. And then lastly, you've got to, this whole topic of cultural competency, it ties into the whole conversation around race and around ethnicity and all of those things that are over every news website these days. I mean, it is everywhere in our world today. And we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, to have those conversations with each other, to think about ourselves and where we are. We really have to be uncomfortable because that is the only place that growth comes from. So, how do you get culturally competent? Well, you have to have 3 attributes. And the first, you've got to be curious. You've got to, again, be seeking. You've got to wonder what the world is like over there, or what the world is like across the street, and how they think about things and how other people interact with each other. You have to have that curiosity. Einstein said, I have no special talents. This is Einstein. I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious. We have to have that passionate curiosity to get through this. And we have to replace that fear of the unknown, that fear that keeps us in place, with curiosity, so that instead of staying in place, we'll move forward. We'll cross the street, and we'll learn. The second attribute, then, I think, is hospitality. And I don't think of hospitality as opening my door and inviting people in for dinner. I think of as hospitality as a much broader thing and concept. And I think that it's opening our hearts to people and allowing them to come in and have a safe place to be. That's what I think hospitality is. And so that's why I think it's an important piece here, because when you are trying to get to that cultural competence place, you have to be willing to let people enter your space and be comfortable. Your job then is to make them comfortable in your space. And the way we do that is by asking questions and watching and learning, and then evaluating what we've learned. And then lastly, other people who talk about cultural competency talk about empathy. And I have a little bit of an issue with empathy just because it says you understand other people. And I honestly believe that unless we've lived that other person's life, we can't fully understand them. Because had the things in our world that they had in their world, and vice versa. And so this whole concept of namaste or namaste, or however you want to say it, is that you, where everything of you lives, and all that is good in you, while you honor that in me. Simply said, it's I see the good in you while you see the good in me, seeing the good in you. And so it's this back and forth, really being interested in how another feels and recognizing that there's good in all of us. So in German organizations, they actually have what translates to the question department. And it's a department that questions when they're making changes and things, questions, well, what are we doing and what's the motive? And they ask all of these questions. And so now is the time for you to ask questions of anything that I've said at this point, of how we're going to operate. Or do you have questions about any of that?
In the queue at this point, but if
Okay.
you want to give people a minute or two to put something in, I would say move forward, and if something pops up, I'll let you know.
Thanks. All right. And so we're going to move into looking at different things, different pieces of cultural competency. And to do that, when you start on this cultural competency path, you're going to gain some insight. You're going to gain insight about others. You're going to gain insight about yourself. And that insight then is going to lead you to more questions. And those questions are going to lead you to some answers. And then those answers are going to say, oh, well, what about this? And so then there's some challenges around it. And then you look to address the challenges, and then it takes you right back up to, now I have more insight, now I have more questions, now I have more answers, and again, more challenges. And so it's a continuous that there's no end path. So let's start with vocabulary, because words matter. And these are three terms that get mixed up all of the time. And so I just wanted to put all of this out here so that while we're talking together and while you're working with the rest of the world out there, that we all know what we're talking about. So race, then, is how we are identified based on physical characteristics that we got from our parents, our grandparents, and others. And so it's a genetic distinctive physical characteristic. And so within the United States Census, this is how, and you all know these categories. The one I want to point out to you is the one in the bottom. So the 2 or more races, that's actually multiracial, but they don't say that on the census. And more people are choosing that multiracial box on the census. That's one of the ones that they're seeing kind of go up. I mean, we all know that there's a shift coming in majority-minority populations of the United States. The interesting thing is that 2 or more races is actually starting to generate more and more people. And so it'll be interesting. There are countries in this world who, when they are doing demographics, don't ever consider race, which is kind of interesting. In America, this is something we do, okay? ethnicity then is a group of people who identify with each other on the basis of a common nationality, a common background, if they share the same language, if they have traits, if they have customs that they share, traditions. One of the clearest ways of looking at this is in Canada. Quebec is both French, is basically a French-speaking province. And they identify themselves either as Quebecians, I think that's wrong, but you get my point, or they identify themselves as English or white or Caucasian. There's a difference between those that speak French and those that speak English. In the Amish culture, the way that they look at the world is there is Amish and there are English, and that's it. So that's how in their ethnicity they've sorted people out. So that's ethnicity. Culture then is a broader category, much broader category, because it's a system of shared values, shared beliefs, ideas. You might have learned patterns of behavior, explicit or implicit, so it might be something that is said or unsaid. And it is how we interpret the world. It can involve things like art and literature and history of a society, but it also can have less tangible things like language, attitudes, prejudices, folklore. Okay, and then lastly, cultural identity influences how a person behaves and acts, what they believe, and what they actually know. But no cultural group is homogeneous. It doesn't mean that in this culture we only have one race, or in this culture we only have one ethnicity. You can have many races and many ethnicities in a culture. For instance, a culture is religion. So within a religion, that religion can run across race and ethnicity. Okay? So those are the three different ones. You need to spend some time really wrapping your head around this. For those of you that have anything to do with the lending industry, or, with the foreclosure intervention counseling or other kinds of counseling, it's like understanding things like APR. You're not going to get it the first time through. You're not going to understand it the first time you read it, the first time you hear about it. You're not going to be able to just kind of take it and meld it into part of you. And so you need to go back and revisit. If you don't revisit any other slide, you need to revisit this one so that you've got the language down correct, that you've got the words and the vocabulary to continue speaking about cultural competency. So let's take a look at this. We're going to open a poll here. I'm going to open a poll here, which I have to admit. So we're going to look at a poll called Check-in 1. And so Grace's mom is Native American and her dad is African American. This describes her, and if y'all would choose one, race, ethnicity, or culture, we'll take a look at the answer. Michelle, did I do this right?
Did you launch the poll?
There it is. All right.
There it is.
Excuse the learning curve, guys. It's now open. Okay, the majority of you have voted, and you have chosen race, and let's see if that's the correct answer. It is. So that's the classification of real individuals who have physical characteristics that are transmitted genetically. And so that is her race. So we're going to look at the next one. So Grace lives with her mom.
Autumn, you need to close. Autumn,
that.
Need to.
I see it. Yep, got it.
There
okay.
You go.
I hope I'll do better the next time. Grace lives with her mom. Her dad had to move 2,000 miles away for his job. Grace, her mom, and her mom's parents like to make fry bread together, and her grandma is teaching her to be a hoop dancer so she can dance a powwow. Her affiliation with her Native American relatives describes her, and let me open the poll now. Get that, I think I did it right. There you go. So what does that describe for Grace? Okay, so everybody has voted, most people have voted, and we're looking at, most of you said culture. So more than 70% of you said culture, almost 31% said ethnicity, 69% said culture. I'm going to close the poll, and we're going to look at the answer. And the answer is actually ethnicity. And these are members who identify with each other based on common nationality, backgrounds, languages, traits, customs, appearance, or shared cultural traditions. And so this would be ethnicity. And the lines are not real clear between ethnicity and culture. I mean, you just really have to spend some time with it. So you need to take a look at the next one. I did close that one, right?
You did. You closed the poll.
Okay. So let's look at the next slide. And I will open a poll for it. Grace and her mom go to the same Lutheran church with her best friend, Allie, who is African American. Allie attends with her mom, her dad, and her 3 brothers. This describes Grace's, and go ahead, I've opened the poll. So go ahead, oh no, I haven't, there it is. I've launched it. Go ahead and choose. Well, with the majority of you voting, 100% of you have said culture, and that is indeed the answer. The system of shared values. I kind of gave that one to you when I was talking about religion. So let's look at the next one. This one's a little long. I'm going to open, if I can do that. I'm going to launch this. So Allie asks Grace questions all the time about being an only child and having to live so far away from her dad. Grace can't imagine living with her 3 brothers. She likes being an only. Grace's white neighbor, Jaron, is also an only child who lives with his mom as his parents are divorced. Jaron and his mom go to a non-denominational church. Grace and Jaron spend time together after school doing homework when their moms are still at work. Their moms take turns babysitting so that both moms can have some time to herself. Grace's discord with Allie's lifestyle and her connection with Jaron is explained by her, and 100% of, only 10% of you have voted. Here we go. There we go. Okay, the majority of you have voted, and the majority of you said culture. A couple of you said ethnicity, and the answer is culture. So the being and only being children of single mom, that's culture. So let's take a look at, I think there's 1 or 2 more. So Jaron's parents are both white, but he really connects with the stories of his grandfather about growing up with parents who were Holocaust survivors. Even though he goes to a non-denominational church, he feels a deep connection with his Jewish ancestors and often tells people he is Jewish. He wants to travel to Israel when he is older and live in a kibbutz. He loves celebrating the Sabbath and Yom Kippur and lighting the menorah candles at Hanukkah with his grandparents. This describes his, and let me open up this one. There you go. So go ahead and vote. Okay, the majority of you have voted, and 3/4 of you have said ethnicity, and 1/4 has said culture. So let's look at the answer. The answer is ethnicity. It's common background, common languages, customs, shared cultural traditions. So that's where Jaren kind of falls in. And let's look at the next one. And I will launch this one. And here's how this one goes. Allie's mom is white, her dad is black. Allie says she is black. She and Grace argue about this because Grace says Allie is both. Allie says since her skin is dark like her dad's and she has her dad's hair, she feels more black than white. This describes her. Okay, I've got the majority of you voting, and 3/4 of you say race, 1/4 of you say is ethnicity. That answer's wrong. That should be race. I'm sorry. I don't know how I let that one slip through, but it is race. All right, so let's move on. I did all that to show you that sometimes it's kind of hard to sort this out between ethnicity, culture, race. And so I want you to really spend some time thinking about it. Our culture then really shapes how we view the world. And so when we look at the world, there are many lenses that everything has to filter through before we can understand it in our own head. And so our perception of the world is based on what our cultural background is. And so culture can be all of the things that are listed in this wheel and more. Culture can be age. Culture can be, you know, I'm a millennial. I'm not a millennial. I'm a baby boomer, but my son is a millennial. And so it can be based on age. Those are different cultures. Trust me, those are different cultures. It can be based on gender, male versus, I mean, there's a different worldview if you're a guy or if you're a woman. And so that makes a difference. If you go into this outside circle, marital status makes a difference in how you view the world. If you're single, you view it one way. If you're married, you might have some different ways of thinking about it. If you're a parent, you might think about it one way. If you're not a parent, you might think about it a different way. Education, depending on how much education and what kind. So you view the world differently. And so these are just some of them, but these are a lot of the big categories of culture that empathy other people and how we interact with the world. All right, so now I got questions again. The only stupid question is the one you don't ask. So you can't ask a stupid question. So Ellie, do we have any questions?
No, not yet.
Okay, let's keep going. So to talk about what it means to be culturally competent, culture competency, and I'm almost going to read this to you because it's so important to understand. It's not merely knowledge. I can know about another culture, but that doesn't make me competent in that culture. So it's not necessarily just knowing. It's how we think, a way of thinking, speaking, and relating to people entirely within the context of their cultural background. It's not about you. It's not about your cultural background. It's about how you can relate to them within their cultural background and in their cultural context. So as counselors, and that's usually my general audience, you have to make cultural competency a part of how you operate, how you live this world, how you do your work, so that you can alter your practices to meet the needs of your client's cultural context. So it's not about us. It's not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. We really have to make some differences in how we interact with different cultural groups. And we have to think about that, not from a perspective of how it makes it easier for us, but how it helps them to trust us and work with us through the process that we're working with. So cultural competency then emphasizes the idea of effectively operating in different cultural contexts. So if you had 4 clients in one day and all 4 of them came from a different cultural background, the idea is that you would be able to effectively operate with each one of those clients within their own cultural context. Okay? It means getting that cultural information, finding out about those different cultures. And I think that's the juggernaut of some of this, is just learning the different cultures, and how do you do that without offending people, and we'll talk about that. But getting that information, and then once you have it, information is nothing unless you apply it. And so applying that information and that knowledge that you've gained so that you're behaving differently, so that you're thinking differently, so that you're creating policies and procedures that are different than what they might have been before. And so when you learn how to operate based on knowledge that you've had and are applying, that should create this third circle that says a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that enable professionals, or counselors in this perspective, to work effectively cross-culture. So I want to go back to a set of congruent behaviors, so how we act, attitudes, how we think, and policies, how we do our work. So all 3 of those things have to be in sync with each other to really have cultural competence. So again, we go back to the honest, the humble, the seeking piece. Here's another quote around cultural competency. To be culturally competent doesn't mean you're an authority in the values and beliefs of every culture. That's impossible. That's absolutely impossible to be an authority in every culture. But what it means is you hold a deep respect for all of the cultural differences between all of us in this world, and you are eager to learn and willing to accept that there are many, many, many ways of viewing this world. And so that's what you really need to think about. This is a topic that, I mean, it's not like a technical topic where I can say, okay, here's how you calculate income. This is very, very different. This is one of those things that you're just going to have to think about for the rest of your life. There is a cultural competency model that has been put together to help people think about this whole cultural competency thing. And the categories on this cultural left side, on the region, and then cultural incapacity, and then cultural blindness, and cultural pre-competence, and cultural competence, and cultural proficiency. And I think this is, as we go through these, I think this is the place where you're going to realize, A, you don't know what you don't know, and B, you don't know what you thought you knew. This is the place where that sort of starts to emerge. Okay? So first we're going to look at cultural destruction. Cultural destruction is the negative worst end of the spectrum. And so it's blatant attempts to destroy a culture of a given group. Assumes that one group is better than all of the others, and acknowledges only one way of being or thinking, and can go as far as outlawing other cultural approaches. The classic example here is Hitler, is Germany in those days. And so I don't think any of us are there. I mean, I'm going to stay away from the political stuff. But we've seen it in history. And it's recent history. It's not that far away. And so that is what cultural destruction looks like and is. So the next one we're going to look at is cultural incapacity. And what this is it's one step away from destruction. It is somebody who has no capacity to be responsive to different groups. although they don't intentionally decide not to be responsive. So a lot of times, this is caused by ignorance and unfounded fear. So with the cultural destruction, you had Hitler that was saying, this is the view you must have, and the Jewish people must, we must rid the earth of them. That's sort of what the whole prospect was there. The cultural incapacity then was maybe some of the people in Germany at the time who were riled up into enough fear that they were kind of believing them, but it wasn't necessarily their intent to do that, but that's where they ended up. And they don't recognize when their mistreatment is due to cultural differences and perpetuates its occurrence. Some more subtle ways are people who are you just look at them and say, did you really just say that? Did you just say that? And they don't have any idea that what they said was offensive at all. They didn't mean to be offensive. They just didn't know. It's ignorance. It is truly ignorance. And so that's cultural incapacity. Can people in that cultural incapacity, can they be taught? Absolutely. Absolutely. It might be an uphill battle sometimes, but they can be taught. So the next one we're going to look at is cultural blindness. And cultural blindness is where, and you can fill in the word color blindness, because that's the one that you hear the most here. But it's not just race, it's cultural. And it just says we're all the same. We're all people. There's only one race. It's the human race. People that are in cultural blindness really do think that they're not biased. They really do believe they're not biased. And they believe that it doesn't matter what culture you're from, that everybody is similar, and so what we do with one group works with the next group. And this is a place where a lot of people sit, because to address that color blindness or cultural blindness is not true means I've got to do a lot of work. If that, it means that I've got to move away from saying one size fits all to, oh my gosh, there's so many sizes, I don't even know how to count them all. And so it takes an act of courage to move out of this category of cultural blindness, but it can be done. But a lot of people are in a place where we're all one big human race. We are. We're all one human race. But there's a lot of categories below that that impact how people believe what they think and what they do and how they're motivated. So the next one we're going to look at is pre-competence. And I think many, many, many people sit here. So pre-competence is, I get it. I get it. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff I don't know. And I know I'm not doing the best I could serving that cultural group. And so I'm going to go figure out how we're different as an organization than that particular part of our population that we're serving, or how I'm different as a person to that cultural group. And there are some attempts to integrate that information to your delivery of services. So what we do in this space is recognize that the cultural differences exist, but they're acknowledged as differences, and we make minor alterations to how we operate to try to accommodate that, but we don't quite get there. So people that are here are primed and ready to go to the next step. They just don't know how to go. But that's cultural pre-competence. Cultural competence, then, is knowing what you know and understanding what you don't know. And it gives you the ability to interact effectively, because you're going to accept and respect that there are differences among the different cultures. And you do assess your behavior and try to make sure that it's congruent with the culturally competent practices of another culture. And in this place, You're actively seeking knowledge, advice, and consultation. And so when we say consultation, that would be with people of other cultures. This is where you're not afraid to ask the questions, not afraid to be uncomfortable in a conversation, not afraid to admit, I don't know. That's where you are here. And that you are committed, and that's a big piece of this, committed to incorporating everything you're learning and your new experiences into who you are, how you behave, how you see the world, and how you work with your clients. So that's cultural competence. And then lastly, cultural proficiency then is all the way at the positive end. It's where we all want to get to. And frankly, we might never get there. I know two people I can say for sure are here. But these are two people that have made this their life's mission. Okay, I mean, they study this stuff, they talk about this stuff. This is a lot of what their world is, and they are culturally proficient. They proactively regard cultural differences. They work toward getting other people to understand cultural differences. They work toward creating systems and policies that improve cultural relationships. They hold culture in a very high esteem. It's like one of their main values in life. And they are regarded as a specialist in developing culturally sensitive practices. Most of us aren't going to get there. Some of us do, but most of us are not going to get here. Most of us are going to get to that cultural competence place, and that's a good place to be. But for those that want to make this their life's work, want to make this their focus, this cultural proficiency then is where you're going to land. So if we look at this whole cultural competency model, my question to you then is, where are you? Where, if you're honest, and you don't have to say this out loud to anybody, if you're honest with yourself about everything, where are you on this cultural competency model? Because the only way you can solve a problem, and you know this with your clients, is to identify where you are now. This is the assessment that we do with our clients. This is your assessment of where you are culturally in the cultural competency world. Where are you? If you don't start in the right place, if you don't start with all the information and accuracy, just like with our clients, if you don't start with knowing what all your debt is and what all your income is, you can't move forward. You're starting on a false basis. And so you really need to be honest about where you are on this continuum. And so once you know where you are, then you choose where you want to be. Do you want to be culturally competent, or do you want to be culturally proficient? And once you decide where you want to be, now we know where we want to be, and all we have to do is put some action steps in between those two things to get where we want to be, understanding that those action steps are never going to end once you start this journey. Once you decide to be culturally competent, you can never stop, because being culturally competent evolves. All right, so another place for questions. The one who asks questions doesn't lose his way. That's an African proverb. Ellie, are there any questions?
No questions.
I'm putting them to sleep. Okay. So when we're working on this culturally competent way of life, we're not going to get that straight line of success. It doesn't go that way. In our heads, we think that that's what success ought to look like, but in actuality, it looks like is the picture on the right-hand side. This is going to be, at times, 1 step forward, 6 steps back. It can be 6 steps forward, 2 steps back. It can be 4 steps forward, period. But it's never going to be a straight line. And so you have to give your self permission to make mistakes along the way, to misunderstand something, or not ask the question quite right and offend somebody. You've got to be willing to accept that that's how you learn this, and that's okay. So, for instance, there are some small cultural differences in many, many ways. I've just picked out a couple of them, just to give you an idea of how easily we can offend somebody. So in the United States and Britain, that symbol of putting your fingers and thumb together, that means okay. In Japan, it means money. In Russia, it means the number 0. And in Brazil, it's an insult. It's sort of like, you know, our little middle finger salute here in the United States. And so, you know, we have to know what some of these differences are. I took 4 years of Spanish. I had a Colombian Spanish professor in college, and she was married to a Cuban man, and they took their up at his family, and they left the little 3-year-old Cuban grandma. And when they came back, the Cuban grandma was all up in arms, wanting to know how they were raising this child and what they were teaching her. And they were kind of taken aback, and they finally find out that what happened was this 3-year-old used a word in the Colombian dialect, which means you silly goose. In the Cuban dialect, however, it was a very, very, very filthy insult for a woman. And the Cuban grandmother was quite offended until they explained this. And so you see where just that little bit of information makes a real difference in how we view the world. At one moment, grandma was offended. At the next moment, she knew she was just being called a silly goose. Another one is eye contact. So in America, we have initial eye contact. We know that we're supposed to make eye contact with people that we're meeting. You know, you meet them, you shake their hand, you make eye contact. But then we don't keep staring at people because that's offensive, that's rude. So we kind of let our gaze wander. In the Arab world, their culture requires a great deal of eye contact. That's a sign of respect. And if you were to greet them the way you would greet an American, they would see you as being disrespectful or rude to them. And so that's another little difference. In Asian culture, direct eye contact, period, altogether, is considered rude and aggressive. And so unless you're trying to be rude and aggressive, direct eye contact is not what you want to do when meeting people from Asian cultures. And then in some religious cultures, eye contact is seen as being flirtatious or threatening. And so if someone that you meet is from a different religious background, and it's a conservative one that says don't have eye contact, then when they avoid your eye contact, they're not being shifty, they're not being rude or evasive, they're being respectful. But we need to know all of that so that we can properly respond to all of this. One more. So one of the big things that we try to do in foreclosure intervention counseling is build trust. And so there are different kinds of trust cultures based on what your cultural background is. So there's one called cognitive trust culture, and that means show me. Show me that you can be trusted. So you're going to demonstrate that by performing. You're going to, come through for me. You're going to, bring it to me, and you're going to be able to deliver. Going to show me I can trust you, and then I'll trust you. And this kind of trust culture is common in America. It's common in the British culture, the German culture, the Danish, the Australian, the Canadian. There are others, but these were the ones that could fit on the slide, and some of them, the more prominent ones. They all operate in this trust culture. And so you got to show me first before I'm going to believe you. Show me what you can do. You want me to hire you? Show me what you can do. Think about a resume. That's how we hire people. We start with a resume. All right. Then there is a relationship-based trust culture, which means I need to know you before I'll trust you. I need to have a relationship with you before I'll trust you. And so there might be conversations, and they might be long conversations, about non-professional things, interests, what I believe, all that sort of thing. And you might have shared meals, and laughter is a big part of this. And so I need a relationship with you before I can trust you. And then once we've established some kind of baseline relationship, then we can talk about work. And only then can we talk about work. Because now you've shown me I can trust you. Where you'll see that is in most Latin American cultures. You'll see that in Arab, in Asian, and Irish. And it's all based on having a relationship prior to trust. And a third one is a blend of both of them. So I want to know what you can do, but I need to know a little bit about you too. So let's have a meal and talk. We're going to talk about personal stuff and we're going to talk about work stuff. But you need to show me what you can do, and you need to show me I can trust you by telling me a little bit about you. And so where you'll see this a lot is in the French, the Italian, the Greek, the Russian. So there's different ways of building trust based on what your cultural background is and how you view the world. Knowing about others is really important. Knowing about other cultures is extremely important. But the place that we have to start this cultural competency work is with ourselves. And so to know other people, we have to first know ourselves. We have to first know where we're starting from. And so my question to you is, do you have bias? Do you have bias? Of course you have bias. You might not want to admit that you have bias, but we all have bias. You're born with it. It's in your DNA. You can't change that. You can't say, I am not prejudiced, because everybody is prejudiced about something. I mean, it can be as minor as people who drive slow in the fast lane and you can't stand them. That's prejudice. Okay? And so the question is not, do we have bias? Because we do. But what are we going to do about it? Now that we know we have it, how are we going to respond to that within ourselves? And so there are two ways to do that. And the first one is something called intellectual humility. And basically what this is saying is, I know I don't know everything. And I am sensitive to the fact that I am going to probably operate from a position of protecting myself, of serving myself. And it might even be in a way that I don't realize it. And I am sensitive to my bias because it's bias and it's built in me and it was taught to me, and I am sensitive to that bias. And so I'm going to say, okay, that's my bias. Now I know that that's my bias. Okay, great. Now I need to start looking at how that bias is filtering the lens that I'm viewing the world with. So intellectual humility is breaking it down and saying, I don't know. I got this bias. I acknowledge I have this bias, and I want to do something about it because I know it's not the best way to interact in this. Evaluate ourselves correctly. Again, when you're doing this cultural competency work, this is stuff you're pretty much going to do on your own. And so you don't have to prove to anybody that you are something. You don't have to put a public face on this thing when you're evaluating yourself. So evaluate yourself correctly. Be really, really down and dirty honest with yourself. Accept that you don't know a whole lot, that there is a whole lot you don't know. Break that all the way down to there absolutely is more I don't know than I do know. And I know, and that's a really important piece of this. Just say to yourself, I'm dumb. I am dumb about a lot of this. And accept it. That cat's beautiful, but that cat may be dumb about dogs. Just accept it. Know that that's part of who you are, and then your journey is to make that different. other side of this then is, first we had the intellectual humility, knowing that you don't know. And there's intellectual empathy, which is an awareness of, I need to put myself in the place of others. I need to take myself across the street, see the world from that side. You ever gone to your neighbor's house and looked at your neighborhood and seen how different your neighborhood looks from your neighbor's house? That's what you're doing here. That's what you're doing here. And what you're going to do then is to be able to not understand, but be able to see the world from the same perspective as that person across the street, and see their assumptions and their ideas about how the world is, and see the world through those assumptions and through those ideas. Okay? That's intellectual empathy. It does not mean, and I really want us to get this, it does not mean we understand them. It means we can see the world the same way they do. To say we understand someone means that we have to have experience incident, a very similar culture to that person. I lost my dad at a young age. When people say I understand when they lose their dad when they're in their 60s, I just look at them and, I mean, they don't mean to be disingenuous, but they don't know what it's like to lose a parent at a young age. Now, there are people who have lost their parent at a young age. Now we can have an understanding. What they can have is intellectual empathy with me, but not an understanding of really how I feel, really, really understand. So that's, and again, that's a little bit of humility. Yes, ma'am. Oh, we're late.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're at 1:02, and to respect people's time, because some people do have other things that they need to go to. I just kind of want to encourage you to wrap up. And I also just want to say I didn't get any further questions, but I did get somebody saying she wanted you to know that she was definitely not sleeping.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So the opposite of intellectual empathy is self-centeredness. So it's that mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all. And when you think from that perspective, it's unlikely you're going to ever be culturally competent because you can't step outside yourself. So I've got 3 questions here, but they're mostly asked in the assessment, and so we can cover them next week about what makes you uncomfortable, what have you learned, and what are your barriers. And so that's all in that handout that I'm going to ask you to complete before the second part of this webinar. And so just remember that everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's going to live its whole life believing it's stupid. And culture and some of another culture, it doesn't mean that you're stupid. It just means that you don't know yet. That's all it means. So just to wrap up, be aware of your own fallibility. Accept that you have biases. Accept that other people have biases. Adopt a humble belief about the world and now you don't, and that you've thoroughly rejected. Understand that you have blind spots that are out there, and the biggest piece of this is committing to change. So again, there's a handout there. It's called the Culturally Competency Learning Matrix, and it's about you, your experiences, and your plan to learn and be different. And so Albert Einstein, I tend to have a lot of his quotes. The important thing is not to stop questioning. So keep asking the questions. And then there's always a bit of self-care in anything I do, even the webinars. So this is my way of doing a little bit of self-care. Take what you need from the world. Whatever it is, take what you need to keep doing what you do. What you all do out there is changes the world and matters a lot. Ask yourself, what's really important to me? Then have the wisdom and courage to go build your life around that answer. And walk outside your comfort zone, because that's where the magic happens. And can you remember who you were? The world told you who you should be. Back when people would say, what do you want to be? Ask that question. What do you want to be? So part 2 is going to cover how you implement these changes. how you move yourself down that cultural competence. And that's what we're going to be talking about. If you have particular things you'd like addressed in part 2, please let Ellie know, and or let me know, and I'll make sure that it gets included, except if you don't let me know by the end of the week, I can't do that. So that's what I got, and I appreciate you all hanging out with me for 5 extra minutes, and I appreciate Empire Justice for asking me to do this. I love working with people in New York, and I just want you to know you don't get thanked enough doing the work you do, but every single morning I do say small thanks for everything that you all are out making it better. Looking forward to talking with you next week. Ellie, wrap, right?
Yeah, thanks everybody. And Michelle, I'm going to throw up one more slide. Webinars that we have, I got emails about, but just as there were a series of them, so just as a reminder, here are some trainings that are coming up to make sure that you register for them. And otherwise, we'll see you all and hear from you all next week on Wednesday, same time.
And don't forget to download the document. So, have a good week, everybody. Take care.
All right, thanks, everybody.